that all, I think, sets a nice transition into our next panel, which is called Culture Creators, the role of thought leaders, trend makers, and trust builders in societal conversations on gene editing. Now, this is a theme we've started to touch on through other panels, but in particular, we're going to dive in right now to this concept that public views of technology are often shaped not necessarily directly by scientists, but by culture creators and thought influencers. So from community organizers and religious leaders to consumer brands and journalists, the question is, how do culture creators influence and respond to societal perspectives on gene editing? What lessons can we draw about the issues and the approaches that matter most to diverse publics? That is our question for this panel, or some of the questions for this panel. As always, we'll open up the ability to ask questions via the app. And I want to introduce our moderator, David Sittenfeld. He's with the Forum at Boston Museum of Science. He's the manager there, and the Forum really focuses on engaging citizens, policymakers, and scientists in deliberative conversations around emerging scientific and technological issues. In addition to overseeing that program, David regularly gives talks on current science topics at the museum, and he's a member of the Expert and Citizen Assessment of Science and Technology program. So he received a NESACS Salute to Excellence Award in 2011. We're grateful for him for moderating this panel. Thanks to all the panelists, and we'll turn to David to have them introduce themselves in more depth.
Thanks so much, Julie, and thanks to all of our panelists for being here. I think you'll hear we have a really fascinating discussion planned. Just to give a tiny bit of context for this, many people in the room know that the emergence of CRISPR as a research tool in the area of human genome editing has lent new urgency to calls for a broad public dialogue about these technologies and their applications. And of course, this event is part of that dialogue, as we'll talk about. And a recent National Academy of Sciences report calls for extensive and inclusive public participation, developing the necessary content and communicating it effectively, and improving public engagement. And if you read that National Academy's report, there's a huge emphasis on bidirectional and multidirectional conversation so that scientists can learn from the public about the societal and ethical implications of the tools that they're creating. And of course, this event is an important step towards that goal, and we've heard a lot about this as the day has gone on. But now we're going to explicitly move the scope of our discussion to people who are, right now, working to engage people beyond this room, people who are thinking and talking and influencing the communities that they engage with every day. Just to give context for my role, in the Science Center field, we've been working towards this goal by convening dialogues at science museums and other kinds of informal science education institutions around the United States, including discussions on human gene editing that are happening over the next 2 months at about 30 sites around the United States. And during those forums, everyday citizens will consider many of the issues that we've been hearing about today, such as the continuum connecting therapy to enhancement, issues of equity and access to these technologies, and issues like personal and germline considerations. You can learn about that project at buildingwithbiology.org, and you can download materials to have a conversation at your own institution. But my job today is to facilitate a discussion among these fascinating people who have been engaging with their diverse and important communities in ways that I think can spark a conversation among the people in this room and hopefully maybe a little bit more broadly beyond it. And so I'm just going to start in order here by asking our panelists to talk a little bit about who you are and how, before you got to this room today, you've been engaging with communities, how you've been doing that, who have you been talking with, and maybe who haven't you been talking with yet. And we can start with Sheikh Yasser.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me this afternoon. Thank you for that, David. Still trying to process the not trustworthy part of the poll. So, I mean, before coming into this room, I thought I was trusted, but then, suddenly I'm. You are. No, don't worry. When you get to my point in my life, you have to go with a lot of thick skin. So, I think that's actually very telling of the broader society. That's just a reality that we have today. I mean, the place of religious discourse in the public sphere is a challenging one to navigate. But to just focus on the question that you're referring to, I mean, as a senior imam of the Islamic Society of Boston Cultural Center, which is the largest mosque in New England, we serve upwards of 15,000 to 20,000 people in terms of pastoral care, religious services, and a whole host of other needs. And this spans not just Boston, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and beyond, Connecticut. So I definitely am in a position to deal with a whole host of people's needs, in particular with regards to the questions around genetic therapy and people who are facing a whole host of genetic disorders, especially given that in Boston in particular, you have this international community that comes from all across the world, so from the Middle East and other places that are coming here specifically for treatment. So very often what I'll find myself having to do is have a conversation with people around whether or not they can take certain genetic therapies and treatments to deal with their particular genetic disorders or beyond that. So this is a very big, if you will, Islamic legal question. I mean, what kind of treatments and therapies can or cannot be done? There are other questions undoubtedly that people have and consider in this particular regard with regards to, for example, food consumption and genetically modified foods and animals and what kind of things can be eaten or not or cultivated and otherwise, because there is a deep ethical tradition within Islam around consumption and food consumption, what can be eaten or not. So that definitely plays in that regard as well, and many others. But I give some chance. Go ahead.
Thanks so much. I'm sure we'll dive into a bunch of that stuff. Florcy, please.
Hi, my name is Florcy, and I work for the Personal Genetics Education Project at the Harvard Medical School. And before I got into this room, I feel like my role is that of a translator. I'm a community organizer, so I'm the co-founder of Women of Color in Solidarity, which we organize, educate, and liberate essentially women of color, gender non-conforming people of color. And so pretty much grabbing what I learned at PG Ed and through the Harvard Medical School and translating it in a way for people like my mother, for example, to really engage with the topic of genetics and what that means specifically for communities of color, communities that have often been pushed out of the conversation. And we do this through workshops, free workshops that we host, through PG Ed also, going into high schools, going into youth leader groups, and going into different faith-based communities as well.
Thank you so much. Taylor, please.
Hi everyone, I'm Taylor Kane. I'm 19 and I'm an undergraduate student at the George Washington University studying political communication and public policy. When I was 3 years old, my dad was diagnosed with a rare genetic disorder called adrenoleukodystrophy, or ALD for short. So at the time, my mother was told that because of ALD's inheritance pattern, it's an X-linked recessive disorder, that by default I was a carrier of the disease, but that I had nothing to worry about regarding symptoms. But that I did have a 50% chance of passing on the disease to any children that I may have. So less than 2 decades later, it's now known that almost 90% of ALD carriers do develop physical symptoms of the disease. And I became aware of this information when I was in high school, which mobilized me to start my own nonprofit organization called Remember the Girls, which raises awareness and advocates for carriers of X-linked disorders. Because like ALD, there's various other diseases such as Hunter syndrome, Alport syndrome, hemophilia, where carriers are thought to be just carriers and thought to be completely asymptomatic, but in recent years, the medical community has begun to acknowledge that this simply is not true. And I've also been really involved in youth and young adult advocacy in the rare disease community, speaking at various conferences. I spoke at the NIH for Rare Disease Day this year, just about how to get more young adults involved in advocacy for themselves and for their families and for the rare disease community as a whole. And of course, the conversation about gene editing is incredibly important in the rare disease community, just because there are over 7,000 rare diseases and only 5% of them have FDA-approved treatments. So the need for treatments is incredible in the rare disease community, so I'm really excited about everything I've been learning today and to have a conversation today on CRISPR and gene editing.
Thank you, Taylor. Dave, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Dave Stangas. I've been lucky enough to be a scientist that worked in several different sectors at different companies, from energy to technology and now food. I've been at Campbell Soup Company for about 10 years, just under 10 years. Campbell is, everybody knows that brand, but it ranges from Pepperidge Farm all the way to Bolthouse Farm carrots and agriculture in the farming space. one of the kind of across the constituents, I mean, just to answer this question, I've been having conversations and listening, not just on gene editing, but kind of technology and food across our whole value chain. So I talk to farmers, we talk to suppliers, we spend a lot of time with consumers. I speak to a lot of business school students as part of another part of my job. And there's points of view all along this chain, and much to the point of translator, I find myself in that position, often translating both concerns to the scientific community and science to the concerned community on a range of topics.
That's great. Sarah, do you want to talk a little bit from your perspective as a journalist?
Yeah, so my name is Sarah Jiang. I am not related to the other Jiang you heard from today, as far as I know. I am a journalist. I am a staff writer at The Atlantic. I cover genetics and biotechnology, which obviously means in the past few years a lot about CRISPR. I think I've written everything from biohacking to gene editing to the patents. And The Atlantic is a general interest publication. So I think at this point, I am most interested in talking to people who are not scientists and what they think about CRISPR. The past few years, we've had a lot of scientists coming up with ideas. I think it's exciting. We're kind of at the point where we're really starting human CRISPR trials and really starting to see CRISPR-edited crops. And I'm really interested in seeing what people outside of science care about.
Thank you so much. And one thing I think is notable in all the answers that we just heard to my question is that these people seem to be putting the National Academy's recommendation into action, right? They talked a little bit about how they talk with people, but also how they're listening to people about this issue. And I think it's because of everything we've heard so far about how science can inform us, but it really can't tell us what to do with an emerging technology, that to understand how to do it and how to make the best decisions that we can. As a society, we need to do a lot of listening and then thinking together to try to come up with decisions that can maximize the benefits for as many people as we can and then minimize negative outcomes for as many people as we can. And so in listening to people and going out and talking with people in your community. Some of you already talked a little bit about this. How are you doing that? And who is coming to talk with you? And maybe who hasn't come to talk with you yet? And maybe we can start with Florcy on this one.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. So I start always by saying where I'm from. I'm from Chelsea. It's a city right over the bridge. It's 2.2 square miles. It's the most densely populated city. And when I go into my community and I speak on these technologies, CRISPR is actually not the first thing we talk about. And I say this to say because there are needs that are more important than talking about a technology that can't really be attained by low-income people of color and people who are undocumented. So when you think of health insurance and you think of CRISPR being used to eradicate a disease, who is that really for? I mean, by show of hands, how many people have health insurance in this room? Yeah, so when I bring this question into my community, maybe a third stay up. And so when you think about this, it's like, how do I talk about CRISPR when it's not something that's attainable, when you're considering a disease that has been created as a result of where exactly I live? So with city sanitation policies that put hazardous environments specifically in my community, so all the toxic waste of people usually goes to Chelsea. And so we're exposed to more diseases at that rate. But we can't eradicate these diseases because we don't have access to healthcare. We don't have access to this language. So for me, it's by starting that conversation about what does genetics mean, what does the role of environment, how does the role of environment play into educating people first before I even talk about something that can not possibly be attained by people like me.
Thank you so much. Taylor, when people in the rare disease community are engaging with this topic, how are they getting together? How are they sort of initiating the conversations? And who do you see participating regularly?
Okay, so I'll start off by talking a little bit about the ALD community specifically, which is the disease I carry. So for the ALD community in particular, and I know this information because I talked to an ALD doctor, so excuse me if I say anything that's not exactly correct about gene editing or gene therapy. But she told me that for ALD, we've had a lot of success with the gene therapy, which I know is different than gene editing. And recently, the gene therapy for ALD was just given FDA breakthrough technology approval, which is really exciting. So there's been a lot of talk about just gene therapy in general in the ALD community, but the doctor told me that gene editing is needed for certain diseases and not others. So then that opens up the conversation to the rare disease community in general. In my organization, Remember the Girls, we come from a lot of different disease backgrounds, so our diseases are all very different. But basically, a lot of people, even in the rare disease community, don't know what gene editing is, especially people who have found out that they're a carrier of ALD or another X-linked disease by having a child that's been diagnosed with the disease. The first thing on their mind is just to find whatever treatments are currently available for their child to treat their child because it's such an immediate need. And of course, carriers and people in the rare disease community aren't all doctors or in the medical profession like most people here. We're everyday people living our everyday lives, just affected by rare disease. So a lot of us don't have backgrounds in the medical community. I know during the last panel, there was some laughter when we talked about people don't know what DNA is, but people in the rare disease community don't automatically become doctors once they are diagnosed or their kid's diagnosed with the rare disease. But I found that talking in Remember the Girls and the rare disease community in general, that people are very interested in gene editing and learning more about it. And the responses that I got when I brought up the topic in my group on Facebook were overwhelmingly positive. I know that one of the members in Remember the Girls said, if we can save a child from going through a traumatic rare disease, why aren't we, or why shouldn't we? So for the rare disease community, as I mentioned, only 5% have FDA-approved treatments. So, and I can't speak on behalf of everyone, but I feel like a lot of people would agree with me that in our community, the ethical concerns become secondary when it comes to new treatment options that could potentially be available for us. But of course, we still have a lot of questions on things such as the economic exclusivity of it. But it seems that in general, the rare disease community and carriers are very excited about the possibilities of new technology.
Thanks. So we've heard about sort of face-to-face interactions going on in the community. We've heard about online discussions. Dave, I'm guessing your perspective on this is a little different, right? Coming from private industry. How are people engaging with you, and how's it been going so far as gene editing sort of gets into the public sphere and the public dialogue?
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation. I'll try to keep this relatively short. I think that what I found in talking to the constituents that range, I mean, really from the farm all the way to consumers to policymakers, there's a lot of conversation about what this means to them in their kind of point of view. And that's fair, right? I mean, part of my job is to really understand what does the growing community think about this, really try to tap into what consumers are. If they're paying attention to this subject, you know, where are they at on that continuum? What is it? Why is it important to them in particular? I seek out in my role at Campbell and trying to manage reputation and trust for that company, activism and activists that have really strong points of view, very particular kind of, you know, polarized points of view from maybe a scientific community, and really try to understand what they have to say. But you have to kind of ask them very particular what they're interested in and why they're concerned, because oftentimes gene editing, GMOs in general, you know, they get lumped together with, in my role as Chief Sustainability Officer, a more sustainable planet. And, you know, in GMOs and gene editing and which ones are for good, which ones are for bad. And all along those lines, it really helps just to get out and try to find people with points of views. Some come to us and find them, but they're usually a little amplified. If they're going to seek us out with a point of view, that's kind of an amplified point of view, and I'm going to try to find a balance to that as well. I talk to investors, values-based investors, environmental, social governance investors, people focused on the longer term, as well as, you know, kind of the people that are paying attention to the quarter of a publicly traded company. And consumers have really shifted their focus on technology and innovation in food. Right about 2012, we reached a tipping point where innovation went from being a good thing to a bad thing, to a scary thing. And food companies are now battling to get that trust back. And we're seeing that when we open these dialogues, we don't win everybody over, but we're really there to listen and really try to, especially as a company like Campbell, listen to where the consumers want us to go in those part of the product portfolios that they partake in. We can't make everybody happy, but we really can listen to everybody.
Thank you so much. So let's transition a little bit, and I'm going to start with Sarah and then go to Sheikh Yasser. They can transition some of the work. They've already talked a little bit about how they're going out and talking to people or what they're writing about it. And Sarah, maybe you can start. When you write about these things and when you interview people in these sort of niche communities or who are already thinking about it, what are you hearing from people? What are people's perceptions of experts? What are people's perceptions of some of the topics that we've been hearing from today as people engage with you and as you write about these topics?
So I think I'll answer this question by talking specifically about human therapies and possible human applications of CRISPR, which sounds like what most people are talking about when they're talking about CRISPR. So I think as has come up in the conversation earlier, lots of people don't know exactly what CRISPR is or what DNA is. I thought I'd actually recount 2 conversations I had with patients that really made me rethink how we're talking about CRISPR and how we're talking about cures, and a sort of like easy automatic assumption that everyone, of course, will want a cure. So the first conversation I had was with a man with hemophilia, and he was telling me about why he would not want to be cured, either through gene therapy or through gene editing. And the way he put it to me is that having hemophilia was such a core part of his identity. He had been born a hemophiliac, he had grown up a hemophiliac, he had gone to camp with hemophiliacs, lots of his friends had hemophilia, and he kind of asked me the question. He said, obviously there are disadvantages to having hemophilia in this world, but you're a woman, there are disadvantages to being a woman in this world. Would you choose not to be a woman? The second conversation I had was with a woman who was blind, and this was around the FDA's approval of CRISPR's gene therapy for an inherited form of blindness. So this is not CRISPR, but it's a form of gene therapy. And at the time, there were a lot of conversations about how much should this gene therapy cost. And I think it ended up costing $850,000, so almost $1 million. So when you're putting a value on the value of sight, you kind of are getting into tricky territory, right? Like if sight is worth $1 million, what does that say about how we feel about blind people or how we think about blind people? And this woman was extremely high functioning. She was like about to go on vacation with her like young child and taking a train by herself. So she didn't feel like there was something missing in her life at all. And I think she wanted to be careful about when we are talking about a cure. This particular gene therapy could only help a very small number of people with one particular mutation, with one form of blindness. It could not help most people, and she didn't want the marketing or the way we talk about cures to come at the detriment of people that it could not help, who still were living with blindness. So I don't think these perspectives are necessarily representative of every patient and probably not representative of most patients, but they did make me think very carefully about how do we weigh the risks and rewards when we're talking about gene therapy. What do we talk about when we're talking about a cure? How do we value a cure? And what do we think should be cured?
Taylor, how does that resonate with what you're hearing when you talk with people in the rare disease community, this idea that sometimes people's identities are connected by virtue of having a genetic disease and that affecting their personal sort of identity with their culture and their community?
Yeah, of course. So I have 2 things to say on that topic. Well, first off, as Sarah mentioned, her 2 stories are people with 2 different diseases that were able to live with their diseases. However, unfortunately for my dad and a lot of other people that are experiencing rare genetic diseases, most of them pass away. My dad passed away within 2 years of receiving his diagnosis because there weren't any treatments available for him. So for a lot of people, this is life or death. And it's not about your identity, it's simply life or death. So another really interesting thing that I was gonna bring up, I'm assuming that the people you had conversations with were like grown adults.
Yeah.
Yeah. So from a carrier perspective, a lot more diseases are now being screened at birth. I know ALD is now being screened in almost 10 states. So a lot more people with ALD, carriers, and boys that are completely affected by the disease are getting identified. So typically, for ALD, if a boy were to be identified with ALD, he would receive a bone marrow transplant because that's the only effective treatment possibly before symptoms develop. So it's interesting thinking how gene editing could be used in relation to newborn screening when first receiving a diagnosis, I guess before people grow up and their identities are developed around their disease. But in light of being a carrier, I know that there's not really much conversation on carriers using gene editing, just because the symptoms we experience are mild to moderate, and in very rare cases can be more severe. But mostly we're talking about it in lights of our children and our fathers and our brothers and people that are having the full-blown symptoms of the diseases, especially when those diseases are fatal.
Thank you. So Sheikh Yasser, there's this whole idea of people having an identity by virtue of their faith, right? Of who they are and what community they're part of. When you talk with people, whether it's that they come and they have gotten some genetic counseling, or they want to know, whether it's okay for them to consume this thing or whatever, what are you hearing from people more generally about this issue? And has there been a discussion within the community you work with about this, or is this sort of just kind of bubbling up now?
Thank you so much. Definitely, I think that given that we're coming from a religious community, specifically speaking the Islamic faith, God is a big deal, right? So what God has to say, or what God thinks, or what God opines with regards to whatever particular developments the human beings are engaged in, that is an essential question of concern. And that is, I would say, probably the essential framing of a lot of how the different stakeholders in the Muslim community are even thinking about this. So obviously the Muslim community is not monolithic. It's a very complex, diverse, just like any other community. So we have religious scholars, we have scientists, we have mathematicians, and we have lay people, we have a whole host of others as well. And everyone is kind of approaching this from a different perspective, but primarily thinking about, well, what is an Islamic ethical moral consideration in this regard, right? So like I said, from the basic community member who's coming to me saying, listen, we have this particular genetic strain within our bloodline and in our family, and here are the types of gene therapies that can be done. What do you think? Is this Islamically, legally acceptable? Can these types of edits or changes or therapies be, are they okay religiously? So that's just like a pure legal consideration or question of a can I or can I not do. But then there are far greater considerations with regards to what we would consider to be spiritual, ethical, moral considerations about this type of tampering, and if this is something that is acceptable with a worldview that asserts that there is a creator God, right? That there is a creator and that he has created these beings. And so that is obviously a very complex question, and they're not divorced from our perspective in that in Islamic civilization and in the intellectual heritage, science and scientific exploration has been integral. And I would even argue that at the helm of much of scientific exploration in history have been Muslim scholars. But that was never divorced from the greater, I would say, spiritual, moral concerns about what can the human being do or not do, right? So then, therefore, you have a lot of religious institutes and think tanks and research centers that are beginning to think about these. So in 2006, for example, there was a big conference in Cairo that was held around genetic engineering and gene editing and so on that was very, specifically speaking about the current developments and what's allowed and what's not. And it was a very big deal, and it brought together scholars and scientists from all across the Muslim world. But it continues until today, where we have institutes, for example, that are associated with the University of Chicago, Darul Qasim, who are still thinking about medical ethics and scientific ethics and so on and so forth. So, I mean, the questions are very broad, they're wide-ranging, they impact different aspects of what people do. So you have a whole host of scientists that regularly coming up to me to just have these conversations, whether they're in my office or they're having ad hoc gatherings. But at the end of the day, the question is, how do we negotiate the question of God the Creator, right? And what we are able to do or not do given our capacity and what we find ourselves with the certain technologies like CRISPR. Now, obviously, CRISPR is certainly not something that people know. I mean, people are just like everyone else has mentioned. CRISPR is not a technology that your average Muslim or community member is talking about. I think it's definitely in the extreme minority of people who are even familiar with these technologies even existing.
Thank you. Just note to the audience, we have until 5:30 to resolve this issue. Florcy, you talked a little bit about context. And when you talk with people in Chelsea who are thinking about their personal health decisions in the context of maybe not having access to the same technologies that other people do. Once you get there and you've established the context with them and you've talked and you've listened a little bit, what are people saying to you? What issues are coming up? I know you and I talked a little bit and you said sometimes epigenetics is coming up. What are the issues that are most important to people when you talk to them in these conversations that you're having?
Right. Like you said, I think epigenetics comes out a lot when we go into communities, say like Dorchester, Roxbury, or even when I'm talking within people in my community. Epigenetics and historical trauma are a thing that consistently gets brought up regardless when we bring up CRISPR. So it's kind of like a backtrack, like, okay, CRISPR is cool, and we see the benefits of what this technology can do, but let's first talk about how we can ease this tension between the medical industry and communities of color who have been often marginalized by these technologies. So that comes out a lot, and trying to get that conversation going so that then we can lead up to, okay, so how are we gonna have access to tools like CRISPR
Thank
to
you.
engage in?
Dave, you've talked about seeking out people who have different opinions intentionally, maybe even people who are polarized along these questions. After you do that, what are you hearing? What are the thoughts and concerns that people are bringing to you? How do they intersect with what we've been hearing already?
Yeah, they align with the conversation today. There's no doubt about it. It's come up, especially even in the last panel, we talked a little bit about it. Natalie talked about transparency and what that means. And I think there's some universal, if you take a look, like let's focus on the consumer for a second, right? I mean, I've found, in my kind of conversations with people that understand this technology, a much more alignment to being at least open to having access from a human health perspective. But I find on the consumer side, almost once they understand what it is, a fairly universal, at least caution, right? They seem to be open more to health than they even are to food. And there's some kind of core principles that I'm finding, and I've found not just with this audience around this technology, but I've run into these principles in the past. And things like, is it voluntary? Is it their choice or somebody else's choice to make this? Is it familiar? Some of the language we use, not just on this technology, but on others, isn't very familiar to consumers, right? So is it fair, right? Is there equity here, right? Are they being punished somehow? Are they being given something? And this concept of control, like, do I have control in this situation or choice? And I think that the food companies, and I've spoken to a lot of people in our supply chain too, that are working on these technologies in the food and agriculture space and try to help them understand what the consumers are seeing and thinking. We heard a little bit about the agricultural and the grower space, even first panel this morning, right? I mean, there are different, depending on where you're at in the growing supply chain, you're looking at this technology as perhaps enabling or competitive, right? And that's important to flesh out and to understand. The scientific community, Julie invited me to a conversation a few years ago on synthetic biology and gene drive. And there's so much passion in the room to be able to tap into these technologies for good, but even some of the language, right? When I showed up and we started talking about synthetic biology, the first thing I said is, can we call it something else? I can guarantee taking that to a consumer on food and calling something synthetic biology is not going to go over very well. So it's really just trying to, and then translate that to my R&D people inside the company, right? Or the startup technology firms that are coming to Campbell to try to sell a solution. These are all ways that I try to help translate this and go back, as well as try to translate this technology to consumers that are really trying to understand it. Because there's a lot of consumers that are wide open to this kind of technology, and especially when I can bring in a sustainability or a conservation lens to it.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to ask anybody on the panel, are there things that have come up just now that you want to revisit or bring forward now that you've heard other people talk? Dave just talked about a number of considerations he hears from the end users of his product. We heard other people talk a little bit about considerations when you go into a community. Here, listening to one another, is there anything that when you talk with people, they're bringing up and you think is important to raise right now?
I'd just like to add that the last conversation, this concept about and even the last two, does it fit with my moral kind of envelope or whatever right kind of noun you want to use, I think it's, even if it doesn't come out in the conversation, it's there. Like I can hear it if I'm listening. Does this fit with what I feel is right? Whether that's from a food or health perspective, I'm finding that in almost like a justice. Sometimes it's economic justice if I'm striving for livelihood, but sometimes it doesn't fit with my kind of moral expectation of where this should be going.
So I'll just sort of hit on that for a minute. We've found when we talk with people who may or may not have any background in these kinds of biological questions, that we tend to try to do it through case studies, right? We try to find the story of somebody who's grappling with a particular disease or something that needs to be considered from a decision-making perspective. And are there case studies that are really, coming up for you as you talk with people, either when you talk about potentially issues of equity and access, or the question of the difference between individual editing or editing that goes through the germline and can go down to future generations and impact our genome from that way and eliminate disease in a different way? Are there particular things that are resonating with people while you talk to them, and stories that you think these people should hear as they think about how to shape and consider how to engage people around the future of these technologies? I got too heavy.
Well, I think I don't want to.
I can jump in.
Please go ahead.
I just
don't want to dominate the conversation.
I usually dominate the conversation, so I always have to condition myself to stay quiet. It's because I'm preaching all the time. But I think that it's multi-layered in my mind. Number one, there are definitely major moral, ethical questions around what we are doing to the human condition. What are we doing to this earth? What kind of impact are we having that we're sowing with our own hands in this world, and the type of impact that will have down the line? That is certainly, I think, an essential moral, ethical question. I think that's what, I was even brought into many of these conversations, to begin to think about that, because everyone needs to come in, and we need to democratize this conversation as broad as we possibly can, because scientists realize, hey, we're doing a lot of things that are going to have a tremendous impact on people, so let's start listening to what other people have to say. But even that as a framing is problematic to me. And the reason being is that we live obviously in a scientific episteme, right? We live in the age of scientific exploration, and that's a wonderful thing. And there's been so many wonderful developments, and I think that we should continue to explore and dig deeper into the physical realm. But the question of morality, the question of ethics, having almost received now a supporting role, right, in the cast, it's kind of always coming in tangentially, or it's coming in after the fact. I feel like that orientation or that framing is problematic, right? Because we end up finding ourselves having to ask really big moral, ethical questions, but we're scrambling to figure out some answers. Like we're coming, okay, the train has left the station. It's moving 100. It's at bullet speed, and it's like, okay, what are the moral, ethical things that we have to have? Let's have some conversations. Let's have small departments and entities with some basic budgets that can discuss it. But the billions and billions and billions of dollars through venture capital and others going into the scientific exploration, it's just incomparable, right? And there's no doubt that that is very useful, but there has to be a comparable consideration for the moral question, right? Especially now, if I'm going to go back to my specific community, we definitely believe in the duality of the physical and the metaphysical. We believe in the idea that there is a physical material body that we have to treat with tender care and take care of it. But we also believe in a spiritual reality, right? That is an essential part of our belief system, that there is a metaphysical, spiritual reality that has to be negotiated, and that isn't even given prominence over the physical reality, right? So that doesn't negate one or the other. It's just to say that the type of meticulousness that is put here should equally be put here, right? In trying to negotiate these conversations. So obviously, money has a lot to do with this, right? Where is money being put? And that's usually where conversations are being had, or what type of political interests are there, or industrial interests are there, and that's usually where a lot of the funding is. So, when you come to now sit down with communities like myself, or communities that I represent, these are the types of big questions that people are trying to ask. So we used to, for example, trust religious leaders, but now we trust scientists, right? Is that going to be inverted at some point, right? After having seen, for example, some developments around scientists. And I'm just being very real. what is trust? And how is trust cultivated? And what is morality? And what are these ethical concerns? I mean, last week I was telling you before this. Last week I was, with the cardinal on questions around climate change, and the lead scientist on climate change in the Hill was there talking about, finally realizing that this is not just a head issue, but it's also a heart issue, right? Because no matter how much times how often we tell people scientific facts, if people don't feel like this is a big deal in here, they're just not going to be motivated, right? Great. So let's have a conversation around the heart. Let's have a real scientific, nuanced, philosophical conversation around the heart and the spiritual state and how people and where motivations come from, right? Rather than just grounded in tangible material realities, right?
So in service of trying to be as anticipatory this time around with this technology, right, and to try to have the values inform the discussion and how it unfolds, I guess I just asked this panel, what are the things that we should be talking about that maybe we aren't so far, right? We started talking about this conversation with who are you talking to, who are you engaging? What are the things that you think are really important to talk about that maybe haven't been brought up so much? And who are the people who haven't been part of the conversation that are important to bring in? And I'll just start with Taylor there.
All right, thank you. So basically, most of the information that we receive in the rare genetic disease community, we receive it through social media or through conferences. So our community is really big on social media, and we find out about new treatments from other diseases basically through social media like Facebook and Twitter. So 2 things to say. So first off, and I wanted to mention this in reference to a previous question, but in the rare disease community, something that's really unique is that even though there's 7,000 different rare diseases, there's really not a competitiveness that you would expect between all these groups, all these groups competing or trying to get scientists and doctors interested in their specific disease. Since there's so many of us, I feel like in the rare disease community, we always are celebrating new technologies that affect any of the diseases because it gives us the hope that eventually it'll come to ours and that eventually it's going to become our turn. But as far as the conversation goes, I think it's really important for everyone to remember that the rare genetic disease community and other diseases that can be benefited by CRISPR, we are not your crops, the pigs. We're actual people that have opinions and really need to be involved directly with doctors and medical professionals on the conversation. So in my role as the founder and CEO of Remember the Girls, I basically just see myself as a messenger of information. If I find articles or if I find out new things that carriers would be interested in, I share it to the group. And then we see these articles. For example, I shared an article about CRISPR, and the carriers, commented, responded, but people aren't really asking us, what do you think about this technology? Even though we're the ones, not carriers specifically, but the rare disease community are going to be the ones that are receiving it. So I think it's really important to, have more conferences or summits where doctors and people directly in the communities can just communicate and talk about it, because I feel like through my experience, I've just noticed that a lot of times people want to develop treatments, they want to develop new drugs for this certain group, but they're kind of forgetting to ask the group their needs. And as I mentioned, in the rare disease community, most people put the ethical concerns second, just because we really, really need treatments. However, it's just really important to not forget to include us in the conversation.
Other thoughts? What aren't we talking about? Who aren't we talking with? Please.
I think also including youth is important. And I do want to acknowledge the youth that came from different Boston high schools today and who, tried to engage in the conversations that were happening around the tables. But I think it's also important to note that a lot of that language was not accessible to youth. And so to really figure out a way for us to, I mean, that's technically what I do, is translate information in a way that's easily digestible for younger people. But also considering the fact that these youth are the ones that are going to be voting for these technologies, and to keep that into consideration when we are having these discussions and having events like this open to community members, to youth ambassadors. And
Yeah, just piggybacking off of that, I completely agree. when I was trying to explain to my friends in college, like what I was talking about at this conference, like it was just really difficult to try to explain it to people who, it's even difficult for me to understand, having like no science background at all. Like even over the past few weeks, I read articles and talked to various doctors I know in the community, but it's still difficult for me to understand. And the things I read are still really comprehensive, and especially explaining it to my friends who aren't involved in the rare disease community, like that's even more difficult. So if we want the general community, and especially young people, to be able to even know what CRISPR and gene editing and the possibility of the futures are, we need to make it a lot easier to understand for the everyday people, and so they can understand the impacts that it can have, not only, and I know I keep talking about from a rare disease genetic perspective, but just learning about the food and the other animals and how basically this can have an impact on every single person's life. I feel like that oftentimes is overlooked, so.
I would just
Dave, please.
just a couple points to contribute. I think where I've had seen success in advancing these conversations in a way that people are on board is where you're setting principles first. Kind of going to your point, like what are we actually agreeing to try to advance with this technology or other technology? So is it equity? Is it sustainability? Is it conservation? Is it health? And then what are the principles that we're going to move forward on this, right? Is it always going to be for good? Is it always going to be shared? Is it always going to be transparent? And once you kind of you can start to get alignment there, and then you can talk about CRISPR as a tool that moves in that direction. The other thing, just to your point on like I try to find people that are basically agnostic to, like they haven't heard of this stuff, they're not paying attention to this content, but they are stakeholders, right? Sooner or later, they're gonna be engaged. They're either in it now and they just don't know, or if you're in the food system, you're gonna be engaged. People eat. And there's, 80%, 90% of the people are not in this conversation, and the ones that are out on the extremes, and having those two fight with each other doesn't help me at all, right? I mean, I want people to advocate for the center so we can have a conversation.
Sarah, as people start talking about this more in the public sphere and the press starts talking about CRISPR more regularly in terms of its applications, its potential impacts on society, how do we transition to the kind of thoughtful, informed, deliberative, respectful discourse that's happened here today and it's happened here on this panel? How do we do that well? And how do we engage communities in ways that they feel that they're being consulted as we shape the future for this technology?
Yeah, that's a really good question, especially because I can tell you this has been a really great conversation, but the title of this talk is not, no one's going to click on an article title like that. I think that is really hard. I do think that I see my job as seeking out the smartest and most thoughtful people who are thinking about CRISPR and amplifying their voices. So I thought, the question you asked earlier is, what are we not thinking about? Usually it's my job to ask that question. So, I would actually put it out to the room. If there are things that the media is not writing about, not talking about, let us know, let me know. Like, we want to be thinking about things that other people aren't.
Please.
Your last point. I mean, I really do think that, I really do appreciate these types of gatherings, and even being included in this conversation is something that historically maybe people like myself were not necessarily reached out to be a part of these conversations, except if it was happening within my own community, But the fact that we're starting to recognize the need to broaden the scope and to empower different voices because of the clear recognition that this is far beyond any one group of individuals' ability to process and make sense of, and even decide about. I mean, we have to realize without a doubt that this is way beyond any one group or any one orientation or philosophical idea or religious perspective or community to decide on what should be, right? So I think what that requires, that recognition requires, number one, that we really start to build trust. And going back to now the initial poll, right? We have to figure out a pathway to building trust, because there is this massive skepticism that exists, I think, within the scientific community towards the religious community, right? And that's a real difficult thing to navigate, right? Especially from within my own, theological, philosophical framework. I don't see a conflict. I don't have a skepticism one way or the other. I don't see conflict. I don't see a problem, and that's grounded in my heritage, my intellectual, philosophical heritage. So the fact that we've developed almost a type of dogmatism towards one another is a very problematic development, right? So meaning that, you know, you're either, you know, you have a belief in scientism, you know, or you have a belief in some other, you know, philosophical orientation or religious orientation, and then it's just constantly like, you know, it's the battle of wills and ideas. And I don't think that that's the reality. I think science is one thing, scientism is another thing, right? And the same then goes for a Muslim, right? You can't bring, as an Islamic scholar, you can't bring your truth to the table and then, you know, completely dominate and obliterate others and be in conflict. There has to be a real, genuine, harmonious conversation that empowers other voices, that there's a genuine mutuality in the conversation, and then there's trust. And this is the only way that this is going to proceed, right? But if we keep on, and one of the problems that I think is happening, especially given our political social discourse, is just it's you know, widening the trenches between groups of people, right? There's just widening of trenches, and you know, obviously with being a Muslim, I mean, beyond this conversation, you can imagine that there's skepticism just around a Muslim, you know, that there's a whole other discourse in that regard. So having to move beyond that and then just come to, you know, good spirits, good, you know, people of good conscience coming together to think about the future and the well-being, that's only going to happen with a certain type of fraternity and sorority of the human condition. And I hope that that's something that we can, you know, more concertedly work on.
That's great, and let's transition now into the questions that we're getting from some of the people out here. And I'm actually going to go to the second question first. I promise I'll get to that first question, because I think Sheikh Yasser talked a little bit about this whole idea that we all come into these discussions with our own frame, our own perspective. And so when we do engage communities, how do we do that in a way that, A, reflects that we know that we know we have our own perspective and we have to deal with that, and B, that we can be inclusive and responsive to the issues that arise? Thoughts?
I would say the way when I read that question, the way you do that is you listen. You don't talk, you listen. And to Florcy's point, you translate. Sometimes it's hard, I guess, if you have a point of view, but that's the way I would answer. I'm sure others have different points of views, but.
I think it's also helpful to have a sense of history. So, you know, the Atlantic has been around for 150 years, which is both a privilege to work there and also kind of a scary thing. But being around for 150 years also means you've had a lot of opportunities to be on the wrong side of history. So we were founded, you know, 150 years ago by abolitionists. And recently I went back to read some articles we wrote in the early 20th century about genetics, which were unsurprisingly about eugenics. And that was just both interesting and sobering to read. And I think a lot of the questions we're, you know, grappling with now, like how do we use genetics? The themes have come up before. And science has always been shaped by the values of the society in which it's being done. And we obviously have an opportunity to do that right now with CRISPR.
Thank you.
I would just say in terms of like qualities required in the collective, I would say humility is extremely important. You know, we have to learn to be very humble people. And, you know, especially I think as you know, scientists will tell you this more than anyone else, you know, the amount that we know versus what we don't know, the comparison is drastic, right? So we really know very little about this magnificent space that we call the world. You know, we know very, very little. So I think it's, you know, and so coming into these conversations with a healthy dosage of humility when we're processing ideas and thoughts and impacts and considerations, given the fact that there are a lot of, you know, unfortunately a lot of agendas that we have to fulfill. There's a lot of budgets that we have to justify, right? There are a lot of, you know, things that we're trying to pursue. We're trying to maintain deadlines. We have industries that in question, and that sometimes may harpoon, you know, this, if you will, nuanced process of humility. But I think humility is extremely essential in this conversation.
Thank you. So now we'll get to that first question, and you can see it says, you know, where do you get information that you find most credible and trusted? And I'll just tweak the question a tiny bit to say, I think it could be you as speakers, but also people that you're talking with. Where do they get their information, and how do they trust it? And I think to Florcy's point, what form should it be in? How should it be conveyed?
So most of the time I get the information that I share on my Remember the Girls Facebook page and private group, basically through like academic journals that I find on social media that different rare disease groups are tweeting out. I'm also lucky to have close relationships with a lot of doctors that are focused on ALD, so I'm able to share information from their specific studies, and I know that that's like credible and trustworthy just because I know them and I've known them for a very long time now. But and especially with developing my nonprofit, I'm working on getting like a medical advisory board to be able to review the information that I'm sharing. But as my community as a whole, I feel like most of the time people are receiving their information from conferences they attend or social media, because a lot of people in the rare disease community just don't have the means to be able to attend these conferences, or they aren't physically able to. So people really are just turning to the internet to try to find out everything. And as I spoke on before, especially when talking about CRISPR, it's just really hard to find information that everyday people are able to understand. But yeah, I really rely on social media for finding and spreading the word on scientific information.
I think infusing different types of knowledges and realizing the scientific knowledge kind of goes beyond this Western academic realm. So for myself, I use, where I work, the Harvard Medical School, its journals, but I also use knowledge of my elders. And so when you're talking about epigenetics, it has a name for it now, but that's something that you can ask my grandmother, her grandmother's grandmother, that we already known, but now it has like a, a label on it. So infusing the two.
So that sort of gets to this question that has made its way to the top of the discussion now. What methods, words, experiences sort of like, seem to work and seem to put up a wall when you're trying to have a conversation with people about gene editing? How do we engage rather than sort of separate or exacerbate a situation that may already be thorny when you're talking with the people you're talking with?
I guess something that I've noticed is certain language around CRISPR, like a budding technology or something that seems like CRISPR's still far away and not immediately attainable to us in the rare disease community. As I mentioned in the first question, people's automatic response to a diagnosis is, what can I do right now? So there needs to be a way to interpret the language so we in the rare disease community understand that maybe this isn't necessarily immediate to us, but it's something that, I'm not sure exactly how to word this, but something where we should actually be interested in it. Even if we can't use it right now, it's definitely looking forward to the future. And someone actually brought that up to me at the roundtable discussion. She said that when talking to people with rare diseases, she has to be careful because she doesn't want to make patients seem too hopeful about a new technology that they could receive like in the next year. So that's definitely an interesting thing to consider for rare disease patients. But yeah, just in general, again, the rare disease community does seem very interested in the topic, but it's definitely not the thing we're immediately thinking of because it still seems far away to us.
Dave, I'm guessing you've got lots of experiences around this one.
Yeah, I think the way I would approach this one is to focus on outcomes. We have a tendency in the scientific community to focus on the science, but when I'm talking to somebody that has some skin in the game, it's really about what does it mean for them, and what is it like, how does this affect me? And I think in this case, it has to do, if you take a look at food and agriculture, it is, so what are we actually trying to achieve? Are we trying to achieve a more resilient crop? Are we trying to bring in soil health or a nutrition? Are we trying to take out something that causes an allergy in a certain? I think if we focus on what we're actually trying to do, and we can always help people understand how, but sometimes we jump right to the how and we lose 95% of the people that we're talking to. And again, I think if really focusing on listening to people, you want to reflect that language, right? When people tell me what they're concerned about or what they're looking for in their food, that's the way I want to describe what we're bringing to bear.
And I think that's a good place to leave it. I started the conversation by talking a little bit about the National Academy's recommendation that there'd be a broad and sort of bi-directional, multi-directional dialogue around these issues. And I think we've heard that these people are putting that into action. And when the National Academies recommend something, they don't just do it because they think it's a good idea. They've gone through and put many, many, many hours into their consensus reports. And so there's evidence that that approach has promise, at least. And I feel somewhat confident and relieved that these people are doing that and putting, their practice into place. So I want to thank you all for listening to each other, for putting the ground rules forward, and for all of you to listening to us. Thanks so much.